Hey guys, this is Joseph at Face Up.
This is Henry from FaceUp.
Today we're going to be doing a discussion on basically tournament results, maybe a little bit of meta talk of ChaOS, and just basically our thoughts of where the game's going and what might happen with the ban list that's coming in a few weeks, what changes there might be to that, or what have you. So. We have some data that we've collected that we're also going to present in this video. I'm going to try to put them on the screen as we talk, and otherwise I might leave some links to download those if it would be in better resolution. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and talk about I'm going to go ahead and put a list of the titles that have been released in the past 12 months. So in order from oldest to most recent, we have Nora, Recreators, Akashic Records, No Game No Life, Da Capo 3, Aho Girl, Sen no Hato, Overlord, Blend S, Tama 2, Full Metal Panic, Alcana 2.0, Ryo no Ashigoto, Riddle Joker, and as of a few days ago, I think, Gochiusa 3.0.
That's correct, yes.
And so we have not got our boxes of Gochiusa in the States yet. Both Henry and I we play Gochiusa, so we're waiting on our boxes right now. But anyway, so we're gonna, I guess before we get into too many details, do you want to make any comments, Henry, on just the general how the past year has been since these different boosters or titles have been released?
I'll say that in general, most of the purchases I've made have produced interesting decks to play, or at the very least, an interesting deck to play. I like Nora, even though it's a little underpowered in my opinion. It has some unique cards that don't really exist outside of Nora. I really liked certain decks in No Game No Life, although it's frustrating making certain partners in No Game No Life, unfortunately. And I really enjoyed the visual novel sets I picked up, Sen no Hato and Riddle Joker. Full Metal Panic is kind of a weird set that I'm just trying to still get my head wrapped around. It's fully optimized. And Blend is a fun set to play, it's just not that great.
I haven't unfortunately been at the locals that that Face Up plays at for a while because I go out of town during the summer. But I know that you were building. You had a Micah deck. Did you build any of the other partners?
You're talking about Blend S,
Yeah, for
correct?
Blend S specifically.
I've not had the chance to build any other partners in Blend S. To be honest, there's only one other partner that kind of interests me in Blend S, Mafuyu.
Okay.
But Mafuyu, at least hypothetically on paper, looks like a very obnoxious partner to play against.
Okay.
And I'm not sure I want to introduce that into our meta game.
Okay, well, one more thing before we kind of get on with some of this data that we've collected is that I want to make note of which titles that we've actually had at our locals in person. The only ones that we have not had at some point, at least, even if it was very minimally represented during the past years, we did not have any Da Capo 3. We didn't have any Tama 2. And we haven't had Alcana 2.0 or Ryo no Ashigoto. So just
Julian did bring a Da Capo 3 deck recently to our
oh,
locals.
okay, it must have been that Charles list. Okay, and yeah, so just for the sake of pointing that out beforehand, I know a little bit about the Da Capo set and Alcana because I wanted to buy into both of those, but didn't have the opportunity. I don't know, Henry, if you know anything about Tama or Ryo, but I'm not really familiar with those.
Nope, I have no idea what's in them except that one of them has very expensive cards.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put our first chart on the screen for people to follow. And that's basically a chart that I put together for tournament results in the last year. Technically, it's from October 2nd until the present, which I think was just recently, a few days ago, had another trio tourney. And the reason I only did from October is because technically between October 2nd and what would have been August 1st-ish of last year, there were no tournaments, so there was no data to put there. So as you can see, there were a few trios since the beginning of the year. I've highlighted those in blue. The Nationals after the WGP season for 2017 is in the middle. I highlighted that in yellow. Um, so anyway, I guess we're going to go ahead and talk about this for a minute before we uh, ask anything. So Henry, I guess you might have wanted to mention a little bit about the tournament format and trios and just the general sense of what representation, basically what we're trying to show in some of this data that we have, what the significance of any of the numbers or representation is.
So, regarding a very brief overview of trios, trios are 3-on-3 tournaments that ChaOS has. Normally, ChaOS games are played 1-on-1 in single elimination tournaments in Japan, but they've recently introduced 3-on-3 as a more official format in their higher level tournaments. So that's what trios represents. Trio results can be a little funky though, because it is possible to have combination of decks win the trio tournament that aren't necessarily reflective of what I feel the actual best decks of the format are, but for various reasons they can be successful. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you do have to take with a slight grain of salt what you see come out of trios, and you shouldn't jump the gun, basically, on what you see.
Okay, the only other couple things I want to mention before we move on is I did not include the 2 character 1 tournaments, and I didn't include those for the same reason that I didn't include several other tournaments. There are different types of tournaments that they have in ChaOS. They have some specific tournaments that either from how I look at them, they either determine like waifu tournaments or specifically for the sets that are represented. I'm not actually sure how they do that, but if you go on the tournament pages, you can see toward the bottom the ones that necessarily didn't top, say, a WGP or a Japanese championship. So I didn't include those because they seemed less representative to basically the information that we were trying to present.
Yeah, the Ore no Yome tournaments specifically, they have a special ban list that they go by, which is made up of previous winners of Ore no Yome. So it's you really shouldn't take the results of that with any grain of salt. It's not reflective of anything.
And as Henry said, taking trios you have to kind of take those with a different weight, even though I've represented them here. There was actually one trios tournament I missed sometime earlier in the year in this chart, but anyway, that doesn't matter. I do want to make a mention that it's kind of interesting that out of all the titles that have been released in the past year, the only ones that aren't represented in this data are Aho, Rio, and Blend S. Aho isn't really surprising to me because I think to a lot of people it was disappointing. I tried building a deck with it, and it probably has been one of the worst decks that I've ended up with. Obviously, there's stuff I could do to work on and make it better, but it was just a really hard set to build with. There was not flexible tools to use. Rio is relatively recent, but it's not so recent enough that it, shouldn't have gotten results if it wasn't, I guess good enough. Uzusoft, we just had Riddle Joker come out, and they've already had topping, and that was less than a month ago. So, and then Blend S, Henry, of course, better than I do on the set, but it kind of surprises me that didn't top at all because I remember seeing it and it didn't seem like it was a bad booster for any reason.
So Blendless is kind of unique. Now, I put most of my weight when I look at results into the Japan Championship Series because we're not currently in the WGP season.
Right.
And also because Blendless came out around the Japan Championship Series time period. So that's what I look at. Blendless actually had pretty decent representation in terms of people who played it at those tournaments. It just didn't top. Now, this is not abnormal. The previous August set, Daito Toshokan, that actually also had a very high representation, and it did get a couple third place finishes, I think I remember. But it never actually won first place, despite being the overwhelming majority of that set being represented as the majority of that tournament. So Blendis is unfortunately one of those decks. It just came at a time when kind of sandwich in between a couple of really powerful sets, and it just couldn't break through.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and continue to talking about the specific partner representation. I have two different charts for that. I'm going to go ahead and put the first one up. It's basically just the previous chart, but just reduced down all to the specific partners that were used so that people can see which one were used. So this has basically out of all the tournaments, there were 40 different partners. And the ranking on the left is basically the place. Anytime that you see a line, that's basically tied. So, for instance, Tomotaki and Jibril were tied at 4th place because they both had 6 toppings. I have another chart that I will put on the screen maybe in a second. Not sure how I'm going to do the video yet for this, but it is basically this chart, but it's only the partners represented after national, so basically only from tournaments this year. That does include the trios that were from the previous chart. So I guess we're going to talk a little bit about the representation of the partners, what diversity there is in the sets, and just basically the numbers of what top. So we weren't really sure off the top of our head before we collected the data who would be the strongest. We had Henry plays Akari from August. He bought into August. You guys might have seen the box opening. So he was definitely aware of the set. I think I've actually only got to play against you with the deck once, I think. And then I was interested in Da Capo, so I was keeping track of how much it topped around the time it came out. But anyway, so Henry, do you want to put any thoughts into this? I'll take a minute to listen to what you have to say.
So it doesn't surprise me that Akari is the overwhelming winner, I guess you could say, of the last 6 months since the set has been released. This kind of flows into the ban list discussion we'll have a little bit later. But what makes Sen no Hato strong is that it just has a lot of really good cards, but individually there's no cards that are super busted. But if you put them together, the sum of its parts is usually greater than what your opponent has. Because usually within a deck, assuming that it's the average representation of a Chaos deck, there's usually 1 or 2 areas within a deck that a deck is not particularly strong at. August doesn't really have that weakness. They're just good at everything. They're very multifaceted in its offense. It has pretty good defensive options. It could recycle events. It could pretty much do everything. And it doesn't surprise me at all that it had so many toppings in the last 6 to 7 months.
Well, I mean, if you look at it between both the charts, since August was released after the after WGB Championships of 2017, the 9 toppings it has was all this year. So on both charts, it's 9. It's not like the other sets. Like Da Capo, if you're counting from October, it has a ton of representation between like 3 or 4 different partners. But after the first of the year, it's just not as much. Whereas, again, Akari has had all of the 9 toppings since this year has begun.
Now, it's interesting that Sen no Hato actually has some other partners that I think are playable.
Right.
And Akari is actually the most boring partner to play, to be totally honest. But she's boring in a way that's just fundamentally strong within the structure of Chaos. So it works. And usually something like that is very, very effective in a game like Chaos. If you can notice, like the very first tournament that Sen no Hato was released, Kotone was actually the other partner that topped during that tournament. And she actually got first place in that tournament. It wasn't Akari. Akari didn't start, I guess you could say, dominating the tournaments until after that tournament. So there was actually, and this kind of happens sometimes when they release sets where the community is not quite sure where the meta game is going to go. So you might see a more diverse representation at the very beginning of the set's release. But Kotone was just abandoned, and Akari was the way to go. It was just a safer way of playing.
The only thing that I kind of want to make mention of is, the reason I made the 2 charts is because I think it's a significant enough period of time between October and specifically this year where I guess there's enough of a meta shift a little bit to you can definitely see the like strength of some more present or newer sets opposed to ones released last year. But the significance between decks that only top to once versus ones that top 2, 3, or 4 times, I think is important to distinguish, because if something tops once, really in any card game, I think that it's not that you have to brush off the fact that it topped. You don't just say it's luck, but if it can do it more than once, then it's more significant. It has you can give it more credential, the set more credential, the partner more credential, in the results that it got. So the ones that I think that if you look at like specifically 2 or 3 toppings, that's where you get still partners that are strong, but the ones that are toward the top around like basically like rank 4 and 5, that's really where it gets to be stronger.
I agree with that. Like at the April 3rd tournament at Nagoya for the Japan Championship Series, Shiro from No Game No Life actually got 4th place, which is something I was not expecting because she's not even the strongest partner within No Game No Life. But that was the only instance of No Game No Life within the Japan Championship Series this year that topped within the top 4 spots. So you shouldn't put too much weight into that. You shouldn't think, oh, Shiro is super amazing right now, I guess I've got to play her. But, I mean, she's not bad, and you can't completely dismiss it. But you shouldn't put that much weight into it. The other thing I will say, though, I'll make a note of, generally speaking, a set will produce one really strong partner that the community tends to kind of focus on, and that's usually the partner that will end up being the majority representation of that set. And you can actually see this over time as percentage of its OS. Like, it'll start at like maybe 40%, but then as time goes on, it'll go up to like 50, 70, in some cases 100% usage, where every representation of that OS is just that one partner. The Capo is the exception to that. The Capo in the last year has had 3 different partners top. And they actually have, overall, within the Japan Championship Series at least, have the second most tops out of aside from Sen no Hato. So I think that is worth noting. And the Capo seemed pretty strong when it was released to me when I looked at it. So
Yeah,
I think it's a testament to its set strength.
Yeah, I really regret not being able to buy into it. It has some really cool cards. The extra mechanic for the horizontal extras is pretty crazy. It allows you to reduce your cost of basically, I think, almost any type of card except entering for the turn. It's pretty crazy. But anyway, let's see. I guess we're going to... Is there anything specifically partner related we wanted to talk about before we moved on? Oh, I guess just for interest conversing between you and I, if I can't remember if we talked about it in any videos before, but I remember when we were doing work for No Game No Life, doing the translations for that, I think a lot of people at our locals really thought that Sora was going to be the strongest partner and the most represented. And it's funny that out of, I think, all of the charts, he only tops once. So I don't know if it has to do with, just the way that we play and think about the game in the States versus the way that people actually play it in Japan, or kind of what you were talking about earlier, where certain partners, look viable, but then people gravitate toward playing another one, or what it is. But I just think that that's interesting, just from kind of a real personal point of view, opinions that we had, and being able to look down the road and see how that actually turned out in favor or not in favor of what we thought.
Well, regarding Sora, if that one placing he had, he got 1st place. That shouldn't be ignored. That being said, I do feel that Sora has underperformed, especially compared to some other No Game No Life partners. And I feel that he could have been more successful. Sora has some fundamental issues within his deck that makes playing his deck a little more fragile. It's easier to disrupt his deck than it is some other decks. But I definitely think, regardless of that, he probably should have topped more. So I actually don't know the reason why he didn't top more. But
it's possible that it's just popularity, and the characters in the end.
That is possible, because he's not one of the more popular characters within the show. So that is possible.
So I guess let's go ahead and talk about... I guess just let's kind of focus on what we think might happen with the ban list now. Unless there's anything you want to add before we continue on to that topic.
The only thing I will say is that Riddle Joker is very strong.
Yeah, I like it.
Riddle Joker will probably take August's place from this point forward until another set comes and replaces Riddle Joker.
Have you finished any? Okay, so I believe you did a sort of like a quick build of Ayase. When you got the set, have you explored building any of the other partners yet?
I haven't explored building the other partners yet. I have further optimized ISA, and she's actually a lot like Akari from August. She's kind of generic.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't do anything super spectacular individually, but she does a lot of things, and it makes her very versatile, and it makes her very multifaceted, which makes her, as a result, harder to stop. She's just a very solid, stable partner, and when you have a card pool that's also very solid and stable, you tend to have a lot more success in chaos with partners like that, and you don't have to rely on gimmicks like No Game No Life, where like the Dribble deck relied heavily on gimmicks in order to win, and if the gimmick didn't go off, well, kind of lost pretty badly.
Right. Yeah, I know. I don't know if there's anybody watching this that saw. I streamed a box opening the other night, and I ended up pulling the Mayu SP. Well, first of all, if you watch it, you know that I was hoping for the Nanami SP because I want to build a Nanami partner, and at least on paper, that deck looks really strong also. But I ended up buying a Mayu deck, and I haven't been able to, or I built a Mayu deck, sorry. And I haven't got to test it in person against anybody yet, but that partner also looks to be really strong, so just echoing what Henry is saying, that Riddle Joker seems to be really strong. We can talk about what it looks like, what we maybe thoughts of upcoming sets after the ban list. But let's go ahead and move on to the ban list. So I'm actually really interested what you think, because you're the person playing Senno Hato, you're the person playing August. What your opinion on since Akari has the topping for all the results that we have the data for, if you think the set needs to be banned, or if it should be banned, shouldn't be banned, and just kind of the likelihood of whether or not that will happen, and how they'll do it if they do ban.
In order to understand my answer to this, you need a little history on Chaos's ban list, and basically, they've only banned stuff that has dominated the metagame and that your opponent cannot deal with in almost any way whatsoever. So I'm going to give some examples of this. When Ars Nova was first released in their extra booster set, they released an event that allows you to essentially speed summon, which essentially allows you to break the rules of the game by getting an extra character out per turn that you wouldn't normally be able to do. This is different from Trespass, because even though Trespass allows you to bypass the normal entry rules for a turn, you're not gaining a net positive character by trespassing. You still end up with the same number of characters, even if you were to bring out a character normally by entry that you would have if you just brought out a character normally by entry. Speed summoning is different than that. So it gives you a tremendous offensive advantage, and during the time, the metagame was extremely slow. So anyone that had speed summon was pretty much unstoppable, and at the time, there really weren't ways to deal with that. That event was banned, and then Toho shortly later released a partner that had a similar mechanic to that. That partner got a special restriction. Now, since then, there have been ways they've implemented ways to deal with speed summoning, but that's just to give you an idea of like their logic behind bans and restrictions, at least in regards to Chaos. So, and I realize I have a bias because I own these sets and I play them and I like them. I personally don't think, despite the fact that Senno Hato has been dominating the tournament scene in Japan for the last 6-7 months, I actually don't think anything is going to get restricted or banned from Senno Hato. And same way, I actually don't think anything is going to get restricted or banned in Riddle Joker. Even though I think that will naturally replace Senno Hato. And the other reason why I say this very fast, they didn't touch Konosuba from last year.
Right.
Konosuba was extremely dominant, extremely powerful. They never touched it.
Yeah.
They also didn't touch Kemono Friends from last year. Kemono Friends was extremely dominant, extremely powerful, and extremely obnoxious to play against.
Right.
Untouched. So, and like I said before, Senno Hato, there's no individual card in Senno Hato that makes you go, wow, I just can't deal with this. It doesn't matter. Like, my card pool is just, it can't deal with these cards. But it just has a lot of really above average cards, and when you put them together, it makes it really hard to deal with. Riddle Joker is kind of the same way. Riddle Joker actually has more holes than August, but Riddle Joker is more powerful in certain ways than August was, which is why I think it's just going to naturally replace Sen no Hato. And if you notice, Konosuba and Kemono Friends have kind of dropped off the face of the metagame. They're not as represented anymore, so just natural shifts in the metagame have forced that. And from my experiences in other sets that I've seen, I don't think... Ironically enough, I think Full Metal Panic has the one card that you could arguably maybe restrict, even though the set itself is not that powerful. And I think they designed the set to be not that powerful because of that one card. And I think it's a really stupid card. But the card I'm referring to is Lambda Driver. It's an extra. It essentially allows you, in the right conditions, to be able to do an anti-stat gain to any character on either player's turn during battle phase. That is extremely powerful. And there's essentially no cost to using this. This is extremely powerful.
Well, especially in the way that the direction the game is going, that I think is such it's a card that you would want to run really in any deck in any series because well, two things that I want to mention in the direction that the game is going is I think that they're giving making it a lot easier to buff characters. And a lot of cards and sets have ways to buff characters naturally or more naturally, just easier. And the buffs are usually bigger. You can see that in Riddle Joker, just other sets that have had even basically since the beginning of the year. I think August has it a bit too, which is probably why it's been strong. And so the fact that if it has that card that can just anti-stat gain something, then that, you know, if they're coming out with a bunch of cards that can do that now in a lot of the titles, then it just makes it an incredibly useful and, you know, incredibly useful card for a bunch of different situations.
So what really makes that powerful, though, is the fact that you can do that during either player's turn. Generally speaking, it's not that hard to do that on your turn.
Right.
But it's more difficult to do it on your opponent's turn, at least via things that are not events.
Right.
So that's not an event effect that I'm saying. So you can't do any event immunity nonsense, none of that.
You said that's an extra.
It's an extra that you just flip up.
Oh, dang.
Yeah, so
yeah,
that's probably the only card I can actually think of in the last year that might be worthy of a restriction. However, because Full Metal Panic was probably designed around this extra existing, the set itself isn't that powerful. And as a result, it's not really affecting the metagame. It does have some placings in the Trio Survival tournaments, but in the singles tournaments, it doesn't really have that much of a presence, so I don't think it's going to be touched.
It's more of like a reasonable result. Like, it's right there. Like, if you look at the second partner, the one that's the data chart that I made, but it's only for this year. It has 3 wins, so it's kind of tied for third, but it's more of like a right in the pocket of representation of how strong that card and some of the other cards is, and that it's relatively recent. But you know, it doesn't look like with the trajectory that it's going to jump up anywhere. But obviously, it hasn't been underrepresented, or at least under top not as much as it could have via basically having cards that can do things like that. So,
and I think True Survivor is actually the perfect format for a set like Full Metal Panic to thrive in, because it allows the rest of the team to kind of make up for the flaws in Full Metal Panic while still getting the full benefit of having someone playing Full Metal Panic on your team. So I think that's actually the perfect format for it. Unfortunately, Blendis does not benefit from that, but, you know.
One more thing while we're talking about the ban list hypothesis is considering you can see on some of the charts that Da Capo has done really well. I mentioned this to Henry earlier, but again, on the second data chart that I have where it shows just this year, you can see how much Da Capo has fallen off. So, in my opinion, and Henry, you may or may not agree, but I don't think there's any reason why they would touch that anyway, since they've also dropped off in all the partners for this year.
I agree. And going by the Japan Championship Series, it actually hasn't gotten first place a single time. It's gotten fourth place, third place, second place, and second place. The 2 second place finishes are great, don't get me wrong, but and one of them was earlier in the year. That was in the February 14th tournament. But it hasn't gotten first, and that's usually what people focus on the most. typically.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's just there. I don't think it's going to be touched.
Okay, so I think the last thing we're going to talk about the video is just talking about some of the future sets that are coming out. So technically, Gochiusa is already out. People in Japan and overseas, they obviously have their product already. As I mentioned, we are still waiting for it. But I haven't looked at the card pool too much. I've kind of looked around it, and just looking at some of the prices, obviously besides the absurd high rarity SPR prices, there's nothing really too breathtaking in the set. I think a lot of the partners have, sort of modern strength. Not really sure which ones are going to be the most dominant, but I know which one I want to play Shadow. But anyway, um, I don't know if you've looked at the card pool. I'm not seeing anything too amazing without playing it.
I haven't looked at the card pool yet. I only looked at the special rare prices because I'm expecting to pull a special rare. But aside from that, as long as someone who has played Gochumon from the beginning, as long as they release a modernized foundation for the set, I'll be happy. Because unless they make something really busted in the set, which it doesn't look like it, at least going by prices, it doesn't look like it. It's not going to be able to compete with Riddle Joker one-on-one, at least on even footing. So I don't really care about that. As long as it's not completely unviable, which it currently is. So
the only card that I think worth mentioning is one of the PRs is it's an event that I think has Cocoa on it, and I was looking at it last night, and it's pretty. It's got a pretty good effect. I can't remember what the part of the condition of the cost is. Something simple like having a same OS partner, something like that. I think it might be having a specific extra and extra deck face up, and then I think you backyard a card from hand. It has 3 different effects, but one of those effects basically reduces damage you take from your opponent's partner by 5 for every copy of that in your backyard. And it's not like a lot of other events where you can only play that twice. So once you use it for the 4th time, you're taking 20 less damage from your opponent's partner during that turn.
I'm actually looking at the card right now. I think the most important thing about that effect is the fact that it lasts until end of turn.
Right.
Usually effects like that don't last until end of turn. And now some people might be wondering, well, what does that matter? Because a partner can only attack once. That's not true.
Not
a lot of partners can reach that. So being able to stop both partners' attacks by making their damage almost nothing is pretty significant in my opinion.
And the fact that it has 2 other effects that you can, they're just kind of, if I remember, I think like one of them is anti-pin and another one is, I can't remember what it is, but it's like some generic good effects that you can also use. And that just gives you a way to put those into your backyard. I'm pretty sure that event isn't a once per turn either.
No, it's not.
So you could technically play 2, and I mean, it would be like pretty heavily costed if you're taking away that many cards from your hand.
No. It is once per turn.
Okay, I was about to say, because that, Anyway, so that's the only card that really stuck out to me. The price is definitely reflecting it right now. I guess another thing we could quickly talk about, even though we're supposed to be talking about future sets, is the fact that they've changed to having box toppers that are actually incredibly useful for the most part. It's annoying for buying them and hoping to pull them, but I'm kind of like on the edge. At first I was upset because they were expensive, but they seemed to, in all of the sets, I can't remember the first one that got it. I think it was like Tayutama, I think, too. Earlier this year was the first one they started doing it. But to me, it's kind of nice having a few extra cards that are actually really, that are good and reliable, that are at least as good as a rare. It's just kind of adding a few more cards to a set other than the price tag on some of them.
So my biggest problem with the box toppers being like that is the fact that if you don't live in Japan, getting some of these cards are near impossible, at least for the first couple months of release, which can be a big downer. And obviously, hoping to rely on pulling these specific cards you want, especially if you need multiple copies of it, is extremely frustrating because you only get 1 box topper per box. That's my biggest problem with it. If I lived in Japan or I had access to a healthier secondary market of Chaos singles around me, then I probably wouldn't care, to be honest. But it's the fact that it essentially creates another barrier for me or someone else to play the game without having to resort to proxies,
Right.
And without having to make an obviously inferior deck because you just don't have these cards.
Right. Anyway, so I guess let's see. The only other sets that we know that are upcoming are there's another Overlord set. There's another Gochiusa
There's
set.
not another Overlord set. What are you talking about?
Anyway, we don't really know anything about those, so there's nothing we can really talk about in terms of, you know, what's going to happen, especially without seeing card pool being spoiled. I guess
I think Joe meant to say a Fate set coming out.
Oh right. Oh yeah, Fate. Well, we only know I think 1 or 2 cards from that anyway. But so I guess other than what we've said about Gochiusa, what we've mentioned about Riddle Joker being strong, I don't think there's anything else in terms of like immediate present releases or future releases that we can say much about. So pretty much done with the discussion unless you have any other things to add.
I will say that, and this actually started with Full Metal Panic, I believe, unless it started with Tayutama, which I don't know anything about. They're introducing ways of protecting your waiting room from removal effects.
They're also doing that with sets on your board. They have that in Gochiusa and Alcana 2.0.
Right. I think that is something we're going to see going forward. I think we should probably expect that in the new sets. We'll see how much of an impact that has. I have noticed some interesting metagame shifts from in terms of deck lists from Japan, that they've kind of shifted away from things that have become almost kind of staple-ish in deck building, at least from Japanese deck building philosophy. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, same. I don't know. Just in generally speaking, though, I mean, it's always fun to play card games, Chaos, and I just think the changes, whatever kind they are, it's always at the bare minimum, whether or not they might seem concerning or whatever. It just seems fun to me that there's new things that come to a card game. So I for one am excited. I just bought into 2 sets, so I'm excited to play them and see what they can do. Anyway, so I think that's it for the discussion. So thank you guys for watching. If this seemed interesting to you, we might do another one in, I don't know, around the end of the year, maybe WGP season or something like that. Henry, last thing, anything?
I hope Fate really sucks, because I don't want to buy a 3rd set in the last 3 months.
Okay.
That's all I have to say. And I hope that Overlord does not get any more sets ever.
Yeah, period. That, especially within such a short amount of time. Anyway. Okay, so thank you guys for watching. We appreciate it. Leave comments on this video either on our Facebook page or YouTube page if you'd like to comment or have any discussion. Thanks again.